I didn't see the papers until a Tuesday morning in October, and even then, I almost didn't read them. That's the part that still gets me. I almost set them aside. My son-in-law had left a folder on the kitchen counter, the granite one my daughter picked out when they remodeled 3 years ago, the one I paid for but never said anything about because I didn't want to start something. The folder was pale blue, the kind lawyers use. I thought it was something for the house, a deed, an insurance renewal. I poured my coffee, sat down at the table by the window, and opened it because I had nothing else to do at 7 in the morning. It took me about 45 seconds to understand what I was reading. Then I closed it, set it flat on the counter, and finished my coffee standing up. I want to be careful about how I say this next part because I know how it sounds. I'm 63 years old. I've been careful my whole life. Not secretive, not hiding anything, just careful. My father was a machinist in Akron. He told me when I was about 9 years old, don't talk about money with people who don't need to know. I took that seriously. My daughter, bless her, never took it seriously at all. She grew up comfortable, and she married a man who thought comfortable was the baseline, not something you built. His name is my son-in-law. That's how I'll refer to him. He gets no more than that from me. I moved to Portland when my daughter was in her late 20s, about a year after she got married. Her mother, my ex-wife, had remarried and moved to Scottsdale, and I was rattling around a 4-bedroom house in Columbus with nobody to eat dinner with. My daughter called and said, "Dad, just come here, we have room," and I thought, why not? I was retired from the utility company. I had time. I sold the house in Columbus, and I came. That was 6 years ago. For the first year, it was fine. My son-in-law was a project manager at a commercial construction firm downtown, and he was away a lot, which I say not to be mean, but just because it's relevant. My daughter and I would have dinner together 2 or 3 nights a week. We'd watch old movies on the couch. We'd drive out on weekends to the coast. Those were good years, honestly. Some of the best I can remember. Then he got promoted. I don't want to say the promotion changed him, because that would be too simple. More accurate is that the promotion revealed him. He started coming home and talking about the team, the firm, the deals. Always loudly, always a little too loudly, like he was performing for someone I couldn't see. He started correcting me at dinner. Not about big things, about small things. The kind of corrections designed to let you know that someone thinks you're a step behind. He corrected my pronunciation of a restaurant name once. In front of my daughter. She laughed because she thought he was joking. He was not joking. I stopped going out to dinner with them after that. Told my daughter I was tired, which was true, just not the kind of tired I meant. Here's what my son-in-law did not know about me. When I retired from the utility company at 58, I had a pension, yes, but I also had 31 years of careful saving. Not flashy investing, not crypto or options or anything with that kind of heartbeat. Index funds, mostly. Some commercial property in Columbus I'd held since my early 40s. A small strip of retail units near the university, nothing glamorous, but it had stayed full for 20 years because of the sandwich shop on the corner that had been there since 1987. I had an LLC my accountant set up in 2009 after the financial crisis, just as a shield, the way a sensible person puts on a raincoat before it rains. I also had the farmland in eastern Ohio, 63 acres my father bought in the 1960s, that everyone, including me, forgot about until I went through his papers after he died and found the deed folded inside a Bible. Farmland in that part of the state had gone up considerably. Considerably is a polite word for it. None of this came up at dinner. None of it was on the kitchen counter in a folder. I don't own a boat or a second car or expensive shoes. I drive a 2017 Camry that I got a good deal on, and I eat the same breakfast most mornings. There was nothing for my son-in-law to see, so he saw nothing, which is, I should tell you, exactly how I prefer it. Now, the folder. I stood at the counter reading the folder, and what I read was a legal document my son-in-law had apparently commissioned from an attorney whose letterhead said he was located in Lake Oswego, which is the kind of place that has a lot of attorneys. The document was a proposed amendment to a joint family trust, a trust that included my name, because my daughter and I had set one up together years before her marriage, with the original intent being that my estate would transfer to her cleanly without going through probate. The amendment would have removed me as a co-trustee. It would have replaced me with my son-in-law. It would have modified the distribution provisions so that in the event of my death, the trust assets, which my son-in-law apparently did not know the value of, would flow through my daughter's marital estate, which, under Oregon community property principles, would include him. In simple terms, he was trying to get his hands on whatever I had through my daughter without knowing what he was actually trying to get. There was a handwritten note clipped to the inside front of the folder. His handwriting, which I recognized. It said, "Jill, reviewed with Renner. He thinks 60 days to get your father to sign. Best to catch him in a good mood. Don't overthink it." Jill is my daughter's name. I closed the folder. I put it back exactly where I'd found it. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, and I thought about my father. My father was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who made scenes. When someone wronged him, and people wronged him, he was an easy man to wrong because he was quiet, and he didn't look like much. He didn't argue. He got still. He'd come home from work and sit in the kitchen with a cup of instant coffee and just think. And then, later, he'd do something. Quietly, correctly, and that would be the end of it. I sat on my bed for about 15 minutes. Then I called my attorney in Columbus. His name is Phil, and Phil and I go back to 1994, when he handled the purchase of my first rental property, and we discovered we had gone to rival high schools in Akron 30 years before, and had both played basketball badly. Phil is 70 now and still working because, as he says, his wife would make his life unbearable if he was home all day. I consider Phil one of the better decisions I've made. I told Phil what I'd read. Phil was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Send me the document." I went back downstairs, photographed every page with my phone, sent them to Phil, and then washed my coffee cup and put it in the rack to dry. My daughter came downstairs about an hour later, dressed for the gym, earbuds around her neck. She asked if I wanted anything from the store on her way back. I said a lemon would be nice if she was passing the produce section. She said okay and left. I did not look at the folder. I did not mention the folder. I made toast. Phil called me back that afternoon. He was, to use his word, intrigued. He said the amendment was real and had been prepared by a real attorney, and it was fairly clever except for the part where it wasn't clever at all, because the attorney apparently had not done a full asset search before drafting it, which meant they had written a document designed to capture something they hadn't actually measured. Phil said this happened more than people thought. Attorneys drafting trust amendments for clients who had given them incomplete information, usually because the client assumed they knew what they were dealing with and didn't bother to check. My son-in-law had assumed. Phil said he wanted 48 hours to look at the full structure of my existing trust and accounts. I told him to take whatever he needed. He said, "Don't sign anything, don't mention anything, don't change your behavior 1 inch." I told him I had no plans to do any of those things. He said, "And Miles, just to make sure I understand, your daughter, is she part of this?" That was the question I had been sitting with all day. I'd been turning it over the way you turn a stone over in your hand when you're thinking about something else. My daughter had her name on that note. She knew. She hadn't come to me. She hadn't said, "Dad, my husband wants to do something with the trust, can we talk?" She'd let it move forward. She'd let a man she married 8 years ago draft a legal document designed to shift the control of her father's estate, an estate he did not even know the value of, without saying a word to her father about it. I thought about the granite countertop. I thought about the remodel I'd contributed to, without anyone asking and without me saying anything. Because I loved my daughter, and that's what you do. I thought about the 22 years I'd spent working overtime at the utility company, so her tuition was never a question. I thought about driving 11 hours in a snowstorm to help her move out of an apartment after a bad breakup when she was 24. Her sitting in the passenger seat of my truck, crying and eating a gas station sandwich, and me saying nothing, because sometimes the right thing to say is nothing. I told Phil, "Let me think about that." He understood. Phil always understands. What I'll tell you is that the next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went about things normally. I helped my son-in-law carry in groceries one afternoon when it was raining. He'd bought a 12-pack of sparkling water and a bag of dog food for the dog they'd gotten the year before without consulting me, though I lived there and the dog slept on my feet, so I didn't really mind. We watched a football game together on a Sunday. He explained to me a play that I had seen clearly with my own eyes, and I nodded and said, "Huh, I didn't know that." He seemed pleased. I will tell you that it took considerable effort. Phil came back to me at the end of the second week with a full picture. What he had found, working through the LLC records, the property filings, the fund accounts, the farmland appraisal that I had commissioned quietly the previous spring just out of curiosity, was that I was worth approximately $4.1 million. I want to say that number out loud not to brag, but because it matters to the story. It matters because of what my son-in-law thought he was reaching for versus what he was actually reaching for. Phil said the attorney in Lake Oswego had clearly estimated, based on my lifestyle and apparent assets, that I might have somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000, enough to make the effort worthwhile, not enough to make his client realize he was grabbing a tent peg when he thought he was picking up a thumbtack. Phil also said something that stuck with me. He said, "Miles, if this amendment had gone through, if you'd signed it, which I know you wouldn't have, but hypothetically, your son-in-law would have received a significant, completely unexpected inheritance on your death, and your daughter would have had no independent control over it because of how the marital estate language was structured. He would have had the power, not her. That changed things for me in terms of what I thought about my daughter. She had let her husband do this, but I was not certain she understood what she had let him do. Those are different things. Not entirely different, but different enough." Phil suggested 2 immediate steps. First, restructure my trust completely, removing the joint provisions, placing everything into a standalone revocable trust with a professional corporate trustee. No family co-trustee, no path for a son-in-law to insert himself. Second, commission a full estate plan review with updated beneficiary designations on all my accounts, taking my daughter down to a fixed inheritance amount, meaningful, not punitive, and routing the remainder to charitable vehicles that would be established and locked before any of this came to light. I asked Phil how long. He said, 3 weeks if we move carefully. I said, let's move carefully. I signed the new trust documents on a Wednesday afternoon in Phil's Columbus Attorneys Portland Associates conference room, which took me 40 minutes to get to on the max because I'd decided not to drive that day. The documents were thorough. They were correct. When I left, I had a small folded copy of the new trust certificate in my jacket pocket, and I took the train back across the river and watched the water through the window and thought about my father again. I thought about him sitting at that kitchen table, cup of coffee, thinking. That night, my son-in-law mentioned over dinner he'd made pasta, which he was proud of, and it was genuinely good. I'll give him that. He mentioned that he'd been thinking about the family trust. He said it in that sideways way people use when they're testing a door before they push it. He said, "I've been thinking we should all sit down sometime soon. Talk about estate planning. Make sure things are set up right for the future." My daughter watched me. I said, "That's a thoughtful idea." He said, "I think it's smart to be proactive. A lot of people put it off too long." I said, "You're absolutely right." He seemed satisfied. He asked if anyone wanted more pasta. I said I'd have a little more, thank you. 3 days later, Phil called him. Not my son-in-law directly. Phil called the attorney in Lake Oswego. He introduced himself. He mentioned that he represented my estate. He mentioned that he had been reviewing recent documents and had some questions regarding an unsigned trust amendment that appeared to have been prepared without the knowledge or consent of his client, which raised a number of concerns that he would like to discuss at the attorney's earliest convenience. Phil told me later that the pause on the other end of the line lasted almost 4 seconds. The attorney in Lake Oswego called his client. His client, presumably, went home that evening and had a conversation with my daughter. I don't know what that conversation was. I wasn't there. But I know it happened because the next morning my daughter knocked on my bedroom door before I was fully awake, which she hadn't done since she was maybe 12 years old and had a nightmare about a storm. She came in and sat on the chair by the window. She was wearing the old Ohio State sweatshirt she'd had since college. She looked like she was 20 years old and also like she was 100. She said, "Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't understand what he was doing." "Not all of it." I said, "I believe you." She said, "Are you angry?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I'm tired, but not at you." She sat there for a little while. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. The radiator ticked. She had her hands folded in her lap the same way her mother used to sit when she was thinking hard about something. She said, "What did you do?" I told her. Not everything, not the numbers, but the shape of it, the trust, the restructuring, Phil, the call to Lake Oswego. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long has that money been yours?" I said, "Most of my life." She said, "And you never told me." I said, "Your grandfather didn't tell me either." I found out the same way I always find things out. After the fact, when I went looking. She laughed a little at that, which surprised me. Not a big laugh. Just the small kind that means you recognize something you didn't expect to recognize. She said, he's going to want to explain himself. I said, he's welcome to. She said, what happens now? I said, that depends on him. And on you. She looked out the window for a while. She said, I'm sorry, Dad. I said, I know you are. What happened next happened over the following weeks, not all at once. My son-in-law did try to explain himself once, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd opened that pale blue folder in October. He said it was about security. He said he'd been worried. He said he hadn't thought about how it looked. I let him finish. I said, I think what you mean is that you assumed. He said, assumed what? I said, that you knew what you were dealing with. He didn't say anything after that. Which was, honestly, the first smart thing he'd done in the whole situation. My attorney's associate in Portland sent the amended trust documents to the Lake Oswego firm formally, so that it was in writing and in the record. The associate told Phil that the reaction was, quote, notably subdued. I imagine it was. The numbers in the trust were a significant departure from whatever my son-in-law had told his attorney to expect. I'm still in Portland, still driving the Camry, still eating the same breakfast at most mornings. My daughter and I have dinner together again most weeks. We don't talk about the trust. We talk about the dog, who has decided that my feet are the best place in the house to sleep, and about the old movies we've started watching again on Sunday nights, and about her grandmother's cornbread recipe that I've been trying to reconstruct from memory with mixed results. She filed for separation in February. I didn't push her toward it, and I didn't push her away from it. It was hers to decide. I'll tell you what I told her the evening she told me what she'd decided. We were sitting on the back porch, and the sky was doing that thing it does in Oregon in winter, where it's not quite dark and not quite light, and everything looks like it's underwater. She said, do you think I'm doing the right thing? I said, I think you're doing your thing. That's usually close enough. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was so small. The dog was inside, looking at us through the glass door, confused about why no one was coming in. I built what I built, quietly, over a long time, without making a show of it. I protected what I protected, not because I distrusted my daughter, because I trusted her completely, and because trust, I learned from my father, is not the same thing as exposure. The granite countertop is still there. It's a nice countertop. I still pour my coffee every morning, and I still sit at that table by the window. Some mornings the folder is still the first thing I think about, and then I think about my father, at his kitchen table, with his cup of coffee, thinking. And I think, yeah, I handled it right.